Author, columnist, managing editor of LibertyNation.com, podcast host and conservative policy advocate.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
We're all familiar with the slippery slope that comes from silencing one voice in favor of another. And when such silencing is done at the encouragement of government, history shows us that such a scenario never ends well. But where are we in today's culture on this precipitous slope? Have we passed the point of no return, or are we on the upswing? These are the questions, and we may just have the answers. Welcome to Liberty Nation Radio here on the Radio America Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. On today's special edition, we're joined by Professor Mark Milke to discuss the themes of his new book, The Victim Cult, and we'll be exploring the length and breadth of all things cancel culture with our other guests. Now, I want to take a moment to say a special thank you to our listeners in Kankakee, Illinois on WKAN 1320 AM and 103.3 FM. Thanks for being part of the team. And remember, this show is proudly sponsored by LibertyNation.com, where you can access podcasts, breaking news, analysis, and a range of biting and brilliant shows to whet your appetite for freedom and your fondness for the great American Constitution. The grievance culture is out of control, and the victim cult has grown increasingly toxic. So argues our next guest, prolific writer, columnist, publisher of multiple studies, and author of the new book, The Victim Cult, How the Grievance Culture Hurts Everyone and Wrecks Civilizations. Professor Mark Milke, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me on, Mark.
So tell me, when you say victim cult, are you talking about individuals who adhere to the idea of systematic victimhood that keeps them down? Or is it more social groups or racial groups or sort of a political wing that seeks power and recognition?
Well, all of the above, right? Everyone knows someone who thinks like a victim. Now, they may have been, and we shouldn't downgrade that, or we shouldn't, we should have compassion for those who are actual victims. But everyone knows someone who thinks like an actual victim, whether they have been or not, and wallows in that. And that's a mistake for their own future, as well as all of us. But the victim cult actually looks at what happens when entire groups or even nations latch onto this notion that we're all victims and almost become touchy and paranoid about that. And where does that lead? So in the victim cult, I give various examples from Germans starting in the early 1800s who were victims of the French who had invaded them and yet became really touchy. And as a result, basically went into this isolationist shell for a century and a half and said, look, we don't like Jews, we don't like the English, we don't like liberalism, we don't like the Enlightenment. And this became a real problem. And to put it mildly, and they became fans of, cultural purity. And you hear these arguments again today, don't infect our culture. And of course, later on, the Germans became enamored with race purity, another disastrous, murderous, mistaken road that they trod. So the victim cult is really about groups and societies and entire nations that wallow in victimhood, real or fake, but to their own detriment and to those of others, and almost destroy and sometimes do destroy entire civilizations. But it applies to the person. It can apply to an entire country.
Yeah, I think it's clear to almost everyone that there is a type of also victimhood hierarchy that stems from individuals to groups to societies and things like this. And to some degree, rightly or wrongly, these groups and the hierarchy of the victimhood, it's recognized in law and custom to some degree. And your book here, I think it makes the case that this particular culture is terminally destructive to the society it inhabits. So what's your main case for this?
Well, a number of things. I mean, look, this seems to be part of human nature. I mean, the Genesis narrative, the story of Adam and Eve and, picking from the fruit from the tree of good and evil and the fruit. God says, don't pick the fruit. What do Adam and Eve do? Well, they pick the fruit of the tree of good and evil. Adam blames Eve. Eve blames the snake. Adam even blames God and says, why did you give me this person? Why did you give me this wife? Everybody's, blaming somebody else as opposed to taking responsibility. So it doesn't help when people don't take responsibility for their own actions. And in fact, by blaming others, it allows you to escape perhaps your own blame, your own responsibility in some event that's taken place. I also think it's very un-American. So for example, the traditional American ethos has been, look, we're going to succeed. We're going to be entrepreneurial. We're going to make the best of it. We've left those Europeans and English behind back in the 1700s and 1800s, and we're going to build a country that's founded on this notion of the individual. Well, what victimhood sort of thinking does is it says, look, I'm not responsible for my current state. And some groups, I mean, you see some, only some, I would argue, Black leaders in the United States who blame current differences, say, in outcomes and averages between Black Americans and other Americans on slavery that has been gone for over 70 years, 180 years, almost 2 centuries, well, a century and a half. So this becomes a real problem, because then you look back and you blame things on 20 years ago or 150 years ago, or Bill Clinton blaming part of 9/11 on the Crusades 1,000 years ago. I mean, that was ridiculous. I mean, the Crusades had disappeared from the Arab memory and was reintroduced into the Arab memory by Europeans in the 1800s, in part in a debate over colonialism. And some wanted to blame and said, you as Arabs should blame the Crusades and colonialism for your plight. This is a real problem. Now, look, there are instances where there's a cause and effect link. So in the late 1700s, Quakers released their slaves and compensate them because they recognized, we have obviously hampered you as a human being and hampered your group, Black Americans. And the Quakers did the right thing. But 2 centuries later, to talk about compensation or restitution for slavery, well, that ignores all sorts of other factors that go into incomes and education today, parental influence, family breakup, again, whether you choose to go to college or not. So the danger in becoming a permanent victim and saying, I or my group are the result of what happened yesterday, or especially 50 years ago or 100 years ago, is that you're going to have mistaken cause and effect links, as opposed to the traditional American ethos of, listen, it's not a perfect world. People are jerks sometimes. Sometimes my tribe beat up your tribe 100 years ago or 1,000 years ago, or vice versa. But we're going to have to get along, and we need to treat each other as individuals. Now, again, I mean, that I wouldn't dismiss actual cases of victimization or tragedies and compensation. Japanese Americans should have been compensated, and were to some degree in the 1950s for their land that was stolen by the government in the 1940s. But that's a clear cause and effect link. The further you go back, the weaker that link becomes. So that's the danger with becoming a permanent victim. You start to think you have no agency, no control over your future, and that's a mistake.
We'll be right back after this short break, continuing our discussion with Professor Mark Milke on the victim cult. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And we're back discussing grievance culture and its impact on society with Professor Mark Milke, author of The Victim Cult.
I seem to have these conversations about how victim groups, I guess they call the people, self-professed victim groups. And as you rightly point out, they don't ever tend to internalize or speak directly to their oppressor. That it's more a question of destroying the outward signs of the historical oppression. And we've seen this a lot in both your country, my country, the United States. It's one thing that always pops into my head is George Orwell's 1984, and how the past has become mutable under the powers to fit the present narrative, whether that's statues, books. And it's the changeability of narrative that creates such discord between those who see themselves as victims, as a group or as individuals, and those that are being held responsible. Now, in your estimation, is the ability to change the past to impact the present and future inherent in keeping the victim cult alive and strong? Does that make sense?
Well, let me answer that slightly different way. Let's go back to your point about people who, in essence, are attacking the past, right, by attacking statues. I mean, it's a really weird modern ideology to try and cleanse the past. I mean, we talked about Marxists a moment ago. In the 20th century, at least, in the 19th century, Marxists look forward to a perfect utopia, trying to create heaven on earth. I mean, what do modern sort of victim cultists do? Those who attack statues or blame the past for all present outcomes. In essence, what they're trying to do is create a perfect past. I mean, at least Marxists look forward and in the future thought they could change the future. You've got people who actually think by attacking statues or, rewriting entire historical accounts, that they can sort of cleanse the past of evil or cleanse the past of these clashes between various groups, ours, yours, mine, whatever. It's a really weird utopian ideology as applied to the past. It makes even less sense than Marxism, which at least, was utopian about the future. So that's one part of the victim cult where, well, who would expect the past to be perfect? I mean, my grandmother left Ukraine as a 3-year-old in 1914, tried to get to Canada with her family, obviously, was prevented by doing so by the outbreak of war at the port of, at a port in Latvia. Her and her family ended up traveling around Central Europe and then Siberia for literally about 13, 14 years before coming to Canada. She was a victim, for sure. But she didn't get stuck there. She never even learned how to read or write. I mean, for years, she would mark documents with an X. And I first noticed this as a kid and asked my parents about it. And they said, well, grandma never got to go to school. So there are real victims in history. But somehow her and my grandfather, who was a German that came from Poland in the 1920s, managed to carve out a life in Canada. Now, this is the typical American, Canadian and American, and there's immigrant success stories in the UK as well. These are typical immigrant success stories. But what they point to is the possibility to say, we're not going to deny that bad things have happened in the past, tragedies, but we better figure out how to not get stuck there, to acknowledge it, to make up for it where you can. If you stepped on my foot yesterday and break my toe, you might want to pay for my surgery today. But beyond that, we don't want to hang on to the past too tightly.
So would you say that the book, The Victim Cult, is it more a warning about what could happen if the dark path is followed, or is it a roadmap for people to break out of this particular mindset? Or
well, I would say the former.
Okay.
I would say the former. I don't really do a Tony Robbins, with due respect, 1, 2, 3, here's how you get out of your situation. It really is kind of an historical and cultural account saying, look, this is a phenomenon in history. In Rwanda, you had people of the same color, but who consider themselves different ethnicities, Hutu and Tutsis, pick on each other. First, the Tutsis on the Hutus, pre-1960, pre-independence, and then the Hutus, who blamed everything, their outcomes, any negative outcomes, on Tutsi rule before 1960. And they did this for 30, 35 years through the state, through propaganda, through the media. And we know where that ended in 1993 with genocide in Rwanda. And so this notion that I'm a victim or that my tribe is a victim, again, even if true, and there's usually some truth to this notion, that one has been a victim, or one's tribe, one's whatever you want to call it, has been victimized at some point in history, again, given the history of the world. But the danger of getting stuck there, and the victim cult is about warning against letting people and politicians and those in the media carry that narrative along, because that can be very destructive. And it makes the same mistake. Let's suppose your tribe has been oppressed, whether your tribe is ethnic, racial, whatever it is, or gender. Let's suppose that's true. Well, what happened was you were not treated as an individual, or your ancestors were not treated as individuals. They were not looked at as individuals. And for us today, for someone to glom onto that, though, and say, because my tribe was not treated properly, those who came before me were not treated as individuals in this society. And Black Americans are an obvious example. Well, but to turn that around and to not treat others as individuals today is to make the same mistake that racists in the past made. So it's a very dangerous road to trod, and it leads to bad outcomes, to say the least.
Well, what are some of the other themes that you explore in The Victim Cult?
Well, one of the ironies is that you have even an entire class, a chattering class today, that blames any outcomes between groups when you measure, white Americans versus Asian Americans versus Black Americans versus Mexican Americans, any differences in outcomes. They blame it on, again, racism. It's monocausal. You'll see, various, prominent Black authors do this. Not all of them. There are plenty of exceptions. Thomas Sowell, Walter Williams, and others. Glenn Laurie, John McWhorter just wrote a book on this. But you do have, some authors that blame everything on racism. Well, that's a mistake. But there's also, and so I go into that in the book as well. And you'll see actually that, look, if everything's due to racism, how do you explain again the prominence of, say, East Indian Americans in the census data that have the highest incomes of anyone, and then those from Taiwan ancestry, those of Chinese ancestry more generally, or Japanese ancestry, or Korean. Those are at the top of the income heap, and there's a reason for that. It's because generally they have the highest education levels in American society, and that leads to higher incomes. So I try and dispel this notion that everything that is different between outcomes between groups and data is due to racism. It's not. I also go into this notion, again, from the chattering classes, that Western civilization is to blame somehow for an imperfect society. I mean, whether you live in the United Kingdom as you do, or in Canada as I do, or in the United States, we live in one of the most prosperous, flourishing times compared to any year in history, compared to any century in history. It's not perfect. We live in an imperfect world. We are imperfect human beings. But we should be grateful for the age we live in, despite a pandemic, despite what governments do, despite mistakes, despite wars and tragedy. We've had it pretty good compared to most people in human history. And so, but we've got an entire chattering class that thinks we live in this dystopian, racist society that somehow is oppressive. That's simply not true by any historical account. So I go into that. But the irony of that is these chattering classes, who also blame everything on people with, how can I put this, pale palettes, like mine and yours. The same thinkers that do this and blame Europeans or the Brits, colonialists, for any bad outcomes, take their ideas from Europeans, except they take it from Frantz Fanon, or they take it from, other European thinkers of, 50 and 60 years ago that just thought the West was, irredeemably evil. And so the irony is, if you want to blame sort of some bad outcomes today on Europeans, go ahead, but you should be blaming them on, French postmodernists and not early American thinkers, or, Adam Smith, or Abraham Lincoln, just because Abraham Lincoln lived in an imperfect age where there was still plenty of racism, post-Civil War, and plenty of oppression against Black Americans. So we live in this weird age where people again want to blame people based on skin color, instead of drawing the correct lesson that in past ages, people as individuals were not treated correctly because they had the wrong skin color. They were Black in 1865. But people don't draw the right lessons from that, or 1965 and Martin Luther King, in 1963, before that came to prominence. People don't draw the right lessons from history, which is don't make the same mistake and treat people as anything other than individuals in law and policy. But you've got plenty of voices today that somehow want to make up for past wrongs by really awarding jobs and incomes and college spots at Harvard based on race. That's utterly destructive.
Professor Mark Milke, author of the new book, The Victim Cult, How the Grievance Culture Hurts Everyone and Wrecks Civilizations. So, Mark, please note, where can people get a copy of your book or follow you for your writings?
Victimcult.com. They can also find me on LinkedIn, Twitter, the usual social media channels. But victimcult.com is probably the best place to find out where you can find the book. It's all over America and bookstores and Amazon. But victimcult.com is where you can find the Victim Cult.
Thanks ever so much. Very fascinating.
Thank you, Mark.
You're listening to Liberty Nation Radio, heard across the Radio America network from our flagship station in the nation's capital, WWRC in Washington, D.C. Remember, you can tune in for Liberty Nation from 2 to 3 p.m. Sunday on KBKW 103.5 FM, 1450 AM, the talk of Grays Harbor. Coming up later in the show, we're talking liberty and cancel culture with Scott D. Cosenza. But up next, Orwellian nightmares with Sarah Cowgill. Don't go anywhere. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Sometimes the word Orwellian just gets overused, and sometimes it doesn't get used enough. When language and books are censored, cancellation of free speech is pushed by the very government, and works of literature are cast down the memory hole. It's time to ask if America has gone full Orwell. Well, somebody with her pulse on the heartland of America's national columnist and executive producer of the Conservative 5 TV show, Miss Sarah Cowgill, and she's here to let us know what's happening and what folks are thinking in flyover country. Welcome back to the show, Sarah.
Well, thanks for having me, Mark. It's always good to be here.
Always good to have you on. Now, tell me, Sarah, how are flyover folks dealing with Orwellian culture wars taking place across our media and newspapers? Is it a burning issue for them, or is it seen as more of a coastal elite folly?
You know, it is a burning issue here. It's amazing to me how many people have come in to different places, different coffee shops, just did, you know, your grocery stores, the pubs, the restaurants, and you can hear them talking about Orwell in 1984 and the different books and the different societies that it seems we are entering in. And it's always kind of amazing to me when people start quoting from the original texts, and they do that here. A lot of people are rereading it. So if my little neck of the woods is kind of an indication of what's going on throughout all rural areas, then yeah, they're kind of disturbed by what's going on.
There's nothing wrong with ever rereading Orwell. Always worth doing. There's a changing attitude taking place in the swamp, I think, Sarah. Now, you wrote recently on LibertyNation.com of House Speaker Nancy Pelosi back in 1991 when she visited China. Now, care to tell us that story and then compare it to her more recent comments on the Beijing Olympics?
In 1989, Tiananmen Square just basically blew up. There was a huge uprising, and everybody will remember the iconic picture of the one young student standing in front of the tank. It was an absolute, human rights disaster for China. Not that they care, but they covered it up as well as they could. They released, their own numbers. Most people on the ground and in the hospitals and in different places released, up to thousands in death tolls and injuries. And, the official China word was a couple hundred here and there. 2 years later, there was a junket to China, to Beijing. And Nancy Pelosi, then just a lowly newbie in the House of Representatives, was on that junket. She and two other of her colleagues unfurled a banner walking out on Tiananmen Square, and unfurled a banner that said, for those who, died here, I don't even remember the exact words, but it was rebellious to be in China and actually telling China how bad they were in this incident. And she was stalwart in her trying to keep the human rights, the genocide, all of the problems that China was inflicting on their own people. She was trying to keep that in the light of day as part of her job. Come 2008, when the Olympics were again in China, she wanted to boycott them, athletes and all, because of the human rights issues. Now here we are in 2022, and what she tells the athletes, the athletes from US of A, is to not anger the Chinese. That's a big difference.
It's a major difference, isn't it? What do you think's prompted this change?
I would imagine there's some behind the scenes relationships that we're not aware of. We may assume, we may have an inkling that those are going on, but she's not the only one. I mean, this isn't just a Nancy Pelosi reversal of course. This is an entire government reversal of course. Now, I also mentioned in that piece the book Red Handed. And in that book, it covers a lot of different dealings between the people we have in our government now and the Chinese. And it doesn't look good. It's not a good look for America.
Yeah, I think a lot of it's also a new ideological push from within government on both sides, both Democrats and Republicans, where they don't want to get involved in a sort of a Cold War thing. And so they think that by use of interconnectedness through companies, globalization, if you will, that it will lower a threat level. But with that comes so many strings one might consider them puppets attached to such strings. Now, a final question for you, sir. What will stop the fast-moving charge to censorship that we're seeing now and the rewriting of history?
I would say that there needs to be an America first, an America first kind of agenda. I'm not saying bring back Trump. I'm not saying let's go down that path again. I'm saying that we really need to focus on this country first. And in order to do that, we're probably going to have to get rid of a little bit of baggage. And that baggage is sitting in the swamp right now with a cushy pension. They can go away. We need to, as Americans, get our elections where we all believe in them again, and then vote these people out and vote some new blood in that will take care of this country. Otherwise, we might as well just, steer into the skid.
Sarah Calgill, thank you ever so much.
Hey, thank you, Mark.
Coming up after this short break, is the government abusing First Amendment rights? Don't touch that dial. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Cancel culture is a thing, despite what some in the media and political classes would have us believe. But do private initiatives to have companies pull support from its star vehicles, for example, represent a constitutional threat? More importantly, when government starts adding its voice, is it overstepping the mark? We're joined for our special Talking Liberty segment once again by constitutional caped crusader and attorney Scott D. Cosenza, Esquire, sans cape today. Welcome back, Scott.
You know, if you give me a moment, Mark, I can fashion something together. But thank you anyway for having me.
Old bed sheets, perfect. Now, Scott, so this move by folks to cancel all they disapprove of, when does it cross the line from protest to infringing upon an individual's First Amendment rights?
Well, the First Amendment is about government action to restrict and infringe upon people's right to speak freely. Also some other rights included in that First Amendment about assembly and such. But if we're just focusing on the speech, it's about government actions. It's not about private actions. So as long as the actions are private, which is to say a company that doesn't have a government, control over it, then it doesn't implicate free speech rights.
Well, that's actually the impression that I got from my reading of it. But that really brings me up to the second question. Now, there's the latest rumblings from the White House. And they are being very careful not to mention specific names. We've seen this over the last year of the Biden administration. They've talked extensively about asking the social media giants, your Facebooks, your YouTubes, to curb what they term misinformation. And by that, it seems pretty clear that they mean folks like Joe Rogan, for example. Does this cross the free speech First Amendment line?
I don't think it does, legally speaking, Mark. When I hear about those things, I think of what a real tragedy it is, a real tragedy that the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, abandoned its championing of free speech, because they were the key kind of group in America who stood up for free speech in all aspects. And what would happen if a Republican administration, for instance, did that in a different era, there would be a cultural and political backlash to it. But I don't think there's an actionable legal case there to be made. We had Jen Psaki, talk about doing more, and the implication there was it was about Spotify and Joe Rogan. Does that cross the line? Well, I think it crosses the line for an administration or government official to implicate free speech rights. But is it a threat that can be then, can a person sue the government and say, you've infringed on my free speech rights? I don't think so, because Spotify, YouTube, and other private platforms have the ability to turn around to the administration and tell them what they think of their suggestions, which is hopefully not much.
All right. Now, as a non-American, one of the most amazing things about the US is that you have the right to free speech enshrined in your founding documents. Now, this is something that many people in other countries, they look on with envy. For our American listeners here, don't be fooled. It is something that people from foreign countries look on and wish that they had. But then we see so many people trying to dismantle the very thing that makes you shine like a beacon for the rest of the world. And we find it mystifying. What do you make of it?
Well, the truth is that there have always been a significant minority of Americans who want to shut down the speech of others, that they fail to recognize that only by protecting the other person's speech do they protect their own. Now, perhaps they don't care about protecting their own because either they feel like they'll be in the majority and therefore not be under threat. Let's recall that the only speech that needs protecting is unpopular speech. So if the things you say are popular, you need not be protected because nobody's going to come for you. And so perhaps that's the reason why. Perhaps it's just as simple, and I think this is what we're seeing lately. This wave it's just about shutting down the person's enemy or a rival for short-term perceived gain on their part, and they lack the ability to or the appreciation to see where it leads. And of course, it leads down a very, very dark road.
It's historically one of those things that everybody should be aware of. I think that
if you fail to defend the rights of others because you believe, as you point out, that either perhaps they don't have anything to say or their opinions, they don't believe that their opinions are outside of the Overton window, that window of what's acceptable in culture at a time. And that these people in history, they're always very surprised and shocked and saddened when that Overton window, when it moves and they automatically become the targeted
Seems like
voices.
It's so predictable too. It's like,
it
just
really
wait
is.
5 minutes, buddy. They're going to come for you. There's another thing about what you had said about the how the Americans have the right to speak freely, and that's enshrined in our Constitution. There are plenty of countries around the world that have beautiful constitutions and bills of rights that include free speech that are not recognized whatsoever. North Korea has a great bill of rights. Basically, look at the one for the former Soviet Union. There are a lot of places where these things are guaranteed, but then never recognized. And I think that the thing that makes America special, at least last time I checked, it's minute by minute. Unfortunately, it seems like we still do have those rights that are protected for real in the United States. And while maybe you can't do it with corporate sponsorship, you're not going to be thrown in prison for saying what you think.
Yeah, I think it's something that everybody's wondering about is whether these. There has been a growth in recent attacks trying to cancel people. Cancel culture, despite what Barack Obama says, it is a real thing. It is happening. And there's some people on the left now that are beginning to realize that, prominent leftists. But I think the most prominent one has to be the Joe Rogan issue. Now, the people who have been pushing the most for his silencing through the Spotify platform, I think it's important to point out, just so people are aware, that Spotify didn't make Joe Rogan's podcast big. Joe Rogan's podcast was big, and then he entered a licensing agreement with Spotify. So he could, if the agreement shut down, he could just take his audience with him. That's something important. But is what's happening, all these attacks against him, is it what we might call a grassroots movement, meaning it's a natural uprising sort of thing? Or, speaking of the uprising, by the way, Scott DeCenter's podcast, The Uprising, excellent. Or is it possible that there's more political and financial backing behind the people that are calling for his cancellation?
We call it astroturfing, as the opposite of real grassroots. Okay, Mark. Right. And I think it's 100% astroturfing. The recent dust up, it's been wave after wave. They've come at him with one wave of attack, and then when that hasn't proven successful, it's been another. And now they're sort of compounding things, and I think he's taken some real hits, and in part from his own apology, which I don't think he did anything wrong. And if you didn't do anything wrong, then kind of it's like, why are you apologizing? I think he's lost the game a little bit on that front. But to the kind of astroturfing nature, India Ari, the recording artist, she kind of was the second wave after Neil Young to say that she would take her music off of Spotify because of language that Joe Rogan used. And then at the very end of her video message, she made it all about money. She was dissatisfied with the rate that Spotify reimburses musical artists for playing their music. And she just didn't like it. She wanted to make more money. And she said, so you can have Joe Rogan, but you better pay me more, basically. Well, I don't think that, if it were a sincere protest, that any amount of payment for, if it was a real problem. Joe Rogan doesn't have an issue where audience members are regularly, offended beyond it, according to his statements. That it's totally bogus. This is about people who don't listen to Joe Rogan, don't care about Joe Rogan, and are using basically the ability of social media as a bludgeon to damage someone whose political power they don't trust and fear.
It's interesting that we've all started talking about Joe Rogan's political power. And for those who have actually spent some time, any time really, listening to his podcast, he's very much a centrist as far as I can tell. And the fact that news media, Brian Stelter of CNN, is concerned about the political power that Joe Rogan, a podcaster, holds compared to CNN, the apparently most trusted name in news, should tell us something of interest, I think.
It's funny about Rogan's politics. He supports these lefty kind of libertarian-y lefty sort of folks is how I would say he supports, but he lives very conservatively. He doesn't have 14 wives and a string of, he has a very sort of conservative lifestyle. He preaches, even though he explores issues about drug use and some other things that are, a bit anti-conservative, perhaps, to explore, at least publicly. He does so while talking about self-discipline and how you have to get up and work out and move. And, he's a reader and he's a curious person. So the entire narrative about him being somebody who is, incurious and a reactionary, like a racist who just spouts off slurs is not just not true. It's the exact opposite of the truth. And of course, the same is true for CNN, which is to say that they're the opposite of real news. They're the ones who are crafting the news stories and then molding what they're allowing to be put on the air to fit those things. Joe Rogan would have somebody on the air who has had the vaccine and advises others to have it, and somebody who has the opposite position. But CNN, they will not.
Well, he did have Sanjay Gupta, who is CNN's chief medical advisor, I believe. Or correspondent, sorry. Now, let's move on a little bit here. It's something that's tangential to this. Now, Dave Portnoy of Barstool Sports, he recently filed a lawsuit against Business Insider this week. Now, how does this relate to the cancel culture discussion?
Well, Portnoy is another guy who is not a political commentator, but he skews libertarian-ish, okay? His suit alleges something that I hadn't heard before as a term, and as managing editor of LibertyNation.com, you should be aware of it, is they called it clickbait defamation. So basically it was defamation within the headlines designed to make Mr. Portnoy look like a person who had sexually assaulted women, when in fact that publication had massive amounts of evidence that he never did do those things. And so I think it may be an important suit. It was just filed, like you said, so we'll have to see how things shape up.
Yeah, I think that it's important to point out that most readers, and this is a very sad state of affairs, but most readers of news on the internet will only read the headlines, possibly the subtitle, at most the first paragraph. So even if a place reports in full that Mr. Portnoy has been completely proven innocent of all these charges, the majority of readers will only ever see the headline and then form an impression based on that. And it's a sad state of affairs. But yes, clickbait
even more
defamation.
Insidious in this case, by the way, Mark, excuse the interruption. They put the headline out there and put the article behind a paywall. So only people who paid to read the piece, and even they didn't get the full context, by the way, but most people who didn't pay, they saw the headline on Twitter or on the site itself and didn't pay the money to get behind the paywall. And so their entire impression was based on the headline alone.
Scott DeCosenza, we will keep exploring this very dangerous cultural situation. Thanks ever so much.
Thank you.
And that's almost it from Liberty Nation Radio this week. I want to thank our special guests, Professor Mark Milke, for talking with us about his new book, The Victim Cult, Sarah Cowgill and Scott Cosenza, and of course you, the dear listeners, for joining us. You are appreciated. My final thought for this week. Uncontroversial speech has never needed protection. When we utter opinion that does not push the envelope, no one pushes back. It is the new ideas, the new concepts that challenge conventional wisdom, that make others uncomfortable, that are at the very heart of the purpose of the First Amendment. These radical thoughts and words are the molds for the future. They always have been. Without them, we would still be in a cultural dark age, contemplating the flatness of the earth. And those who push the new and challenging ideas, they need our protection. As Margaret Mead once wrote, "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has." We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
We're doing it for real, really real. Liberty Nation.
And Jeff Charles, contributor for
I think
LibertyNation.com.
we're starting to make an impact. Liberty style, fight for freedom.
The tracking poll sponsored by Liberty Nation for
Guess what?
Thursday.
Mentioned by Dan Bongino, Rasmussen, Jordan Peterson, and
I
others.
can do it again if you want me to.
Cited in Mark Levin's American Marxism.
I think we're starting to make a really big impact. Get noticed. We're doing it. Rock on. I'm gone.